Hello, this is me, Erika Stad von Holstein.
And this is me, Luca De Biase.
Welcome to Reimagine Talks, the podcast to challenge the way we think. And today we are delighted to be here with Daniel Susskind to discuss one of the most controversial topics of today, and that is Reimagine growth.
Daniel Susskind is research professor in economics at King's College London and senior research associate at the Institute for Ethics in AI at Oxford University. He is the author of A Word Without Work and co-author of the bestselling The Future of the Professions. Previously, he worked in the British government, in the Prime Minister's Strategy Unit, the Cabinet Office at 10 Downing Street, and his new book is called Growth, a Reckoning.
Well, first of all, Daniel, thank you so much for taking the time to join us here on Reimagine Talks to explore this fascinating topic. So in recent years, we've really seen different movements going on. Somebody arguing about degrowth, others talking about permanent and growth. So maybe before we go into some of the more thorny details of this debate, maybe you would like to start out with saying, what do you mean by growth and why do you think it's so important?
And it's such a pleasure to be with you. Thank you very much for the invitation. Why do I think growth is so important? The reason it's important, almost more important than anything, is because it's associated with almost every measure of human flourishing. There are very few things that politicians agree upon today, but one of the things they do agree upon is that we need more economic growth. So in the UK, poverty and worklessness are rising. Public services are backlogged and broken. Average real wages, which are the sort of best measure we have of our collective prosperity, haven't really moved for about 15 years. So it's clear that on the one hand, we need more growth, but if only the problem were as simple as that, because growth is also associated with many of the greatest challenges that we face too, whether it's the impact that growth has had on the climate, whether it's the growing inequalities in society, whether it's the impact of technologies like AI that are having an impact on work and politics, whether it's the loss of local places and communities. You can see growth's fingerprints everywhere you look. And so the reason it's important is because we have this thing sitting at the center of our common life together, which on the one hand has this extraordinary promise that, as I said, it's associated with almost every measure of human flourishing. But on the other hand, it's also got this immense price as well. I couldn't think of any more pressing challenge to think about at the moment than the future of economic growth.
In this 21st century, we face some major trade-offs between quality of environment and quantity of growth, for example. But shouldn't innovation be able to overcome this kind of trade-offs?
That's right. So one of the big arguments of the book is that there are trade-offs between growth and other things that we might value, whether it is, as you say, the state of the environment, or, as I was saying, the level of inequality in society, the impact that disruptive technologies like AI have on work and politics, and so on. And so it seems to me that we are confronted by a whole variety of trade-offs between ever more prosperity and protecting these other things that we care about. And so one of the big questions is, well, how do we weaken or soften or sort of relax those trade-offs? And I think, you mentioned the environment, and that's a really good example of where I think we have successfully weakened the trade-off between growth and something else that we care about. So if you go back to 2007, for instance, and look at the Stern Review, which was written by Sir Nicholas Stern, it was the first report of its kind into the economics of climate change. One of the conclusions of that report was that if we wanted to reduce emissions by 80%, we'd have to pay a price of 1% GDP a year. So the next year, Nicholas Stern comes out and says, no, I got it worse. Actually, climate change is worse. Sorry, I got it wrong. Climate change is worse than I thought. It's actually going to cost us 2% of GDP a year. In other words, the trade-off that you're describing had got worse. We'd have to pay a higher price in terms of growth to protect the environment. Fast forward, though, to the year 2020 and look at the work done by the UK Climate Change Committee, which is the body of experts tasked with advising the British government on climate change. They concluded that the cost of eliminating emissions, so not simply reducing them by 80%, but completely eliminating them, had fallen to just 0.5% of GDP. In other words, the trade-off between growth and the climate had collapsed. And so the big question is why? And the answer to that question is fundamentally because not only because technological progress and innovation took place, but a particular type of technological progress took place, namely green technological progress. More specifically, 15 years of changes to taxes and subsidies, to rules and regulations, to social norms, just completely transformed the incentives that people faced in their working lives. And there was an extremely strong incentive not only to develop new technologies, and one of the big arguments of the new book is that new technologies are what drives economic growth, but to develop particular types of technologies, namely those that promote growth and also protect the environment, so green technologies. And the great example of this, I think, is solar energy. So it begins in 1970 as a sort of tool of last resort, for generating electricity in isolated lighthouses or outer space. And yet today they're completely commonplace. Why are they commonplace? Well, because of precisely the sorts of innovation that you're talking about, the sorts of technological progress that you're describing. There was almost a 200-fold decline in the cost of generating electricity via solar, and an exponential increase in their use as a result. And so, just in short, what happened was, there, exactly as you described, there was a great deal of innovation that weakened the trade-off between growth and the environment. And the kind of core practical philosophy of the book is that we ought to be exploring these sorts of innovations, these sorts of technological advances, not only in thinking about weakening the trade-off between growth and the climate, but also growth in these other things that we value, the levels of inequality, the impact that artificial intelligence has on work and politics, and so on and so on. So I think in very short words, that innovation is absolutely key in solving these problems.
And you mentioned the role of politics.
Yeah.
We're now seeing, obviously, different countries, and some countries are growing a lot and are quite stable. Others are very unstable and seeing rising levels of polarization. There seems to be a lot of fluctuations of what is happening. And with this are also coming, new narratives are arising, some blaming growth, some searching for growth. What is the role of growth in these complex dynamics? And do you think that we have the right models and narratives as a society to actually be able to reimagine growth, so it can, as you said in the beginning, that growth is part of the problem, but maybe also part of the solution?
Yeah, I think it's a really interesting question, and I think a really important part of context in part of the context, particularly given the theme of this podcast and the theme of our discussion, which is about reimagining, is that the idea of growth itself is actually a very, very recent idea. So, if you go back to 1950, it's not that long ago, almost no politicians, policymakers, economists, anyone was talking about the idea of economic growth as a policy priority. It's only really something that, got its teeth into our common life in the second half of the 21st century. And so I think that's important to have in mind, that this isn't a sort of a kind of unchanging feature of human existence. It's something that is very modern, very recent, and we can, pursue something different if we want to. I think one of the most, thinking about, the narratives and stories we tell about growth, I think one of the sort of narratives that I set out to, try and sort of challenge in the book is, well, there's quite a few. I mean, one of them is the sort of metaphor that people often have in mind when they talk about growth. there's a sense that it's as if we're on a train and we're sort of trundling along, and the train tracks in front of us are fixed. Our economic direction of travel has been determined for us, and all that we've got left as a choice is to either, pull back on the lever and slow down growth, or push forward on the lever and increase growth. And what I'm trying to argue in the book is that actually that's not right, that a better metaphor is almost like being on a boat at sea. And we can both choose our speed of travel, how much growth, but we can also change our direction of travel as well. We can change the nature of growth too. And it sort of hinted at in the discussion just before, the main tool that we have is by changing the incentives that people face in society. Through taxes and subsidies, rules and regulations, and social norms and customs, we can try and encourage people to develop technologies that not only promote growth, but also protect other things that we care about. And what I do in the book is go through quite systematically all the different dimensions of the price of growth and explain how we might, redirect the sorts of technologies that we're developing. I think another, just in terms of, if I had to pick another big narrative or story that I'm trying to challenge in the book, I think is probably on the causes of growth. I think today a lot of politicians and policymakers have quite an old-fashioned view of growth, that what drives growth are sort of big, impressive projects in the material world, building roads and bridges and buildings and trains and and so on. And actually, that isn't where growth comes from. Growth doesn't come from the sort of tangible world of things that we can see and touch and drop on our feet, but it comes from the world of ideas. In other words, it doesn't come from using more and more finite resources, as many people tend to presume, but it comes from discovering ever more productive ways of using our resources from those ideas. And so a big part of the book is explaining how we can become the sorts of societies and economies that discover more useful ideas about the world, because that's where I think growth comes from.
Great, Daniel. That's very interesting. One idea that persists, though, is the GDP.
Yes.
We measure growth by measuring the growth of GDP. And we know since quite a long time ago that GDP measures good things, but also bad things, provided that they create some value, some money.
Yes.
So why is so difficult to change the GDP, to reimagine the general measure of growth?
Yeah. And so it's certainly true, particularly in economics, that there are many economists, many policymakers who think that the way to solve this problem is to try and find a better GDP calculation, a sort of GDP plus of some kind. So, we ought to include things that are valuable, but we don't capture in GDP. So perhaps, say volunteering activities or time spent in the home. And we also ought to try and capture things that are not good, and reflect those in GDP. So the damage we do to the environment, the level of inequality in society, and we ought to try and measure all of these things and bundle them all together, and pursue this more perfect GDP measure that results. And the argument of my book is actually that I think that's a mistake. That I think we ought not to be trying to do that. What we should do is try and repair the technical problems with GDP. And when we think about GDP, I think what it ought to be is just a very simple technical measure of the value of activity that takes place in a market. So we ought to repair the sort of technical problems with GDP, that, for example, we're not very good at valuing free goods, things like the email servers that we use, or the search engines that we rely upon, and we're not very good at measuring quality. So think about how your iPhone today is unimaginably better than an iPhone 10 years ago, and yet it's very hard to pick up those sorts of quality improvements in a measure that relies upon prices. So we ought to try and repair those technical shortcomings with GDP. I think that's a sensible project. But what I don't think we should then do is try and also make sort of moral adjustments to GDP to try and include things that don't have much to do with the market, but nevertheless we think are socially valuable and important, like, for instance, the damage done to the environment or the level of inequality in society. So I think, while I argue for in the book is a sort of GDP minimalism, a far narrower, stripped down version of GDP and we try and repair its technical problems, but we don't then try and also make this measure of economic activity in a market. We don't try and turn that into a measure of social value in a community. We ought to just do the technical stuff, not the moral stuff. The place for those sort of moral questions about what else we might value and how much we ought to value them ought to happen in politics, not in treasuries and statistical departments, in my view.
This is really very interesting. Actually, our last episode was looking at Reimagine Sustainability with Enrico Giovannini, and he was actually saying that, in his view, to counter sustainability, we were having the wrong numbers, the wrong methodologies, and the wrong theories. Because that's a great starting point to begin with. In your view, you obviously look a lot at the impact of technology, and AI is going to radically change how we work, how we think. Reading your book, I understand that you already consider that we haven't really adapted our thinking even to the digital world, let alone to the AI world. So how do you see that we are going to be able to kind of adjust to these technologies in a smart way and make sure that we use them to actually help this healthy growth that you're talking about, as opposed to maybe pushing this 20th century view of growth?
Yeah. So I think one of the big prices associated with growth are that many of the technologies that we rely upon, particularly technologies like AI, and we're going to become increasingly reliant upon in the future, although they are responsible for increasing our sort of collective material prosperity, they have two substantial costs associated with them. One is a sort of economic cost, the impact that these technologies have on our working lives. And this is what I've spent a lot of my career thinking about until now, thinking about the impact of things like AI on work. As was mentioned, the books The Future of the Professions and A World Without Work are both in different ways exploring the impact that technology is likely to have on the labour market. And I continue to think that we aren't taking seriously enough the disruptive effects that those technologies might have on work. But it's not just work, it's also the impact that these technologies have on politics as well. And I don't just mean the kind of great chambers of state and traditional politicians. I mean the entire social scaffolding that we've all built together to live on. These technologies are in different ways affecting what information we receive, how we deliberate with one another, whose voices get elevated and whose don't. A whole variety of different political dimensions to these technologies too. And so it seems to me, if we are going to find a way to reduce the price of growth, we have to pay very careful attention to these economic and political consequences of particular technologies like artificial intelligence. Because as with this general story, I think they carry with them an extraordinary promise, but also this great price as well.
Daniel, if I may, I think with your metaphor of the boat and all the things that you mentioned, we are not just reimagining growth, we're reimagining economics, and this on one point of view, which is the fact that it used to be that economics was about the means and the ends were somebody else's problem. But if economics is also choosing the direction, or the boat needs to decide the direction, then economics is not anymore just the means, it's also the ends.
Yes.
Which is, you mentioned often inequality. We could mention happiness.
Yeah.
It's a new kind of economics.
Yeah. Well, interestingly, I mean, so economics wasn't always that way. Some decades ago, there was a very different tradition in economics, what the great economist and philosopher Amartya Sen called, rather than the sort of engineering tradition, which is what you're describing there, where economists like to see themselves as the sort of plumbers of kind of contemporary economic life. He said, no, there was another tradition, not the engineering tradition, but the ethical tradition, where economists thought of themselves not simply as plumbers and technical experts, but they thought of themselves as moral scientists. They were interested not only in means but also in ends. But having said that, I think one of the important messages of the book is that actually many of the questions I'm trying to raise are too important to be left to economists, even behaving in that sort of enlightened moral way. It might sound like I'm shooting myself in the foot because I am an economist, but one of the arguments of the book is that we do face these trade-offs between growth and other things that we value, whether it's the climate, whether it's inequality, whether it's what we were just talking about, the impact of particular technologies like AI on work and politics. They raise not technical questions, but moral questions about what we ought to value in society and how we ought to balance the different things that we might value. And my argument is that the place for answering those questions is not in economics departments and not in treasuries and not in budgets and so on, but it's in politics. We have to find a way to try and return some of these very difficult moral questions to politics. And so one of the projects of the book as well is to set out the sorts of innovative political institutions that could support that kind of citizen deliberation and discussion, because I think these moral questions have to be put back to citizens in some form or other. There's these questions. Just take growth and the climate. It's just a question that invites such disagreement, and people feel very strongly in lots of different directions. And the only way to reach a sort of balanced dissatisfaction is through politics. That's the mechanism that we have for engaging with those sorts of disputes. The idea that we can solve it by finding a way to value the climate or finding a way to value, our species diversity or whatever it might be, and bundling that into a measure just seems to me to be dodging the really difficult moral questions, to be treating them as if they're technical ones that can be answered by statisticians rather than moral ones that have to be put back to citizens.
This is fascinating. And I think what you said in the beginning, and that is the future of growth is really based on ideas, because
Yes.
growth is not about the material things, it's about the ideas, and ideas are boundless. There's an infinity of ideas.
That's exactly right.
So to some extent also maybe the solution in finding these political, because we've been working on, for instance, on climate change, and what we see is that
Yes.
80% of the misunderstandings or the polarizations are based on these black box thinking patterns. So where people think wrong, they think it's a trade-off between people on planet, whilst we know in reality that we're trying to save our habitat. The planet will survive very well without us. We will not survive without. But there's a lot of these things where we're just placed in certain patterns of thinking that have not adapted to this new world.
Yes.
As you know, now we have a big European election coming up. And if you had one thing to say to the next mandate of the European institutions when it comes to growth and about reimagining growth, what would your number one advice be in terms of the most pressing thing in order to shift gear and move away from this old way of this dichotomy of...
Yeah. Can I give us? Let me give one sort of I'm going to let me give one high-level thought and then a more granular, a more practical thought. I think the high-level thought is which is that a sense that I get is more and more corners of particularly European politics is turning towards a slogan, in thinking about growth, which began with the degrowth movement, but has now become quite popular, which is this idea that infinite growth is not possible on a finite planet. And one of the big projects of the book is to show that this idea is just it's just wrong. It just rests on a misunderstanding about how growth works. Exactly as you're saying, it doesn't come from using ever more finite resources, but growth comes from discovering ever more productive ways of using those resources, coming up with ideas, recipes for organizing the atoms in the world. Just one example: if you think of a kitchen larder with 300 ingredients in it, that's finite ingredients, but there are more possible recipes for combining those ingredients than there are atoms in the universe. And when we're thinking about growth, we're not talking about ingredients in a larder, but we're talking about quite literally all the materials in the world. And so it just seems to me just so extraordinarily so it's just fundamentally wrong to think that infinite growth is not possible on a finite planet. It is possible, but the problem is that it leads you to this view that just an extraordinarily unimaginative view that our current lot is roughly the best that we can ever do, and we ought to press pause not just for the next 5 years or 10 years or 100 years, but for all time to come. It's just so to think that we've reached some kind of economic peak and that's it. I just think that's wrong, and we ought to be far more, just at a sort of high level, far more optimistic and far more excited about the possibilities for the future. The more practical consequence, though, and this is what would I actually say, is that asking the question, how do we get more growth, is essentially asking the question, how do we generate more ideas in society? And so I think any policy program for generating growth has to grapple with this question about how do we generate more ideas. That would be the one thing I'd say. If they then were to say to me, well, how on earth do we do that? I'd say there's 4 things you need to do. One is you need to reform our antiquated intellectual property regime. It sounds, relatively dry, but of course it's crucial because it's the rules and regulations that control who owns and controls ideas in society. And in my view, at the moment, it stifles the discovery of new ideas about the world in order to protect the interests of those who have already discovered ideas. The second thing I think we need to do is invest vastly more in research and development. Both the levels and the trends in R&D investment, not just here and in Europe, but in the US and elsewhere, are just pitiful. But we cannot expect serious discoveries about the world if we don't invest in them. The third thing we need to do is get far more people into the parts of the economy that actually generate ideas. And the final one is we actually need to use the technologies themselves to help us generate ideas. And that's perhaps one of the more radical ideas in the book. I may have lost the attention of the politician by now because she asked just for one thing, and I've gone on. But I think this high level point that the constraint, bringing all this together, the constraint in thinking about growth is not the finite planet. That's the wrong constraint. The constraint in thinking about growth is that we are becoming sclerotic and tired and stagnating in terms of generating ideas about the world. And that's what we need to focus on, and that's what we need to fix.
How wonderful. What a wonderful note to end this podcast. Thank you so much, Daniel, for having joined, being here with us today to reimagine growth. And I think the idea that we need to start, or that, ideas are the centerpiece of this, and we really need to change the way we think in order to promote that, is a very important message to send. So thank you very much.
Such a pleasure. Thank you very much again for having me.
Thank you.